What is Classical Education by Martin Cothran. I read a magazine article recently in which the reporter went to two Christian colleges, one a more standard Christian college and another with an explicitly classical Christian emphasis. When asked what their objectives were, the first college answered, to save America. The second answered, to save Western civilization. But why is this significant? It is significant because the second school realizes that our problem is not of recent origin and that it isn't unique to this country. The decline in our country and our culture is much more fundamental than most people think, and this decline has a lot to do with changes in education over the last century. Education as it used to be. If we were to visit a good American or English school about 100 years ago, we would find it focused exclusively on one thing: reading classic literature in the original languages. This is what we now call the old classical education. It taught students how to think and what to do. It was an education in wisdom and virtue. Students learned Latin and Greek, and through this they learned a set of vocabulary that undergirds all academic language. And they learned the inherent structure of the grammar, common to all languages, including their own. They also learn the mental skills required to make the fine grammatical distinctions characteristic of these two inflected languages. Having mastered Greek and Latin, they then read, analyzed, and discussed the actions of great men. As always, the chief questions asked about the actions of every great man or woman, the questions every child asks when first reading about a character, was he good or bad? Why did he act as he did? Who was affected by his actions? What were the circumstances? What should have he done differently? What would you have done differently? This was an education in wisdom and virtue. In one of the books studied in these schools, Homer's Iliad, Phoenix, the teacher of Achilles, reminds Achilles at a moment of crisis in his life of what the hero's father had commanded the old teacher to teach him. He was charged, said Phoenix, to teach Achilles, quote, to be a good speaker of words and a doer of deeds, end quote. Speaking and thinking, of course, are just the opposite side of the same coin. So we could say that the education Homer articulates here consisted of two basic things: how to think and what to do. This ideal, the man who would think truly and act rightly, was the goal of Greek education. This was the education of the Romans and the Greeks and everyone who lived in the Hellenic world, including the Jews. It was the education of the Christian Middle Ages, of the American founding fathers, and of their Puritan predecessors. It was the prevailing education well into the early 20th century, before it was gradually thrown out over the succeeding decades. Today's education. Today, a new philosophy controls our schools. Its purpose is much different from the purpose of classical education. Today's schools are about two things: progressivism and pragmatism. Progressivism is a political program that can be seen in an emphasis on political correctness and multiculturalism. Pragmatism is a vocational program that can be seen in an emphasis on job training and employment skills. Today's education is almost a direct inversion of the old classical emphasis on how to think and what to do. The political and vocational emphases of today's education teach students not how to think and what to do, but what to think and how to do it. Its political goal is to use schools to change culture, and its practical goal is to change students to fit the culture. The goal of classical education was very different. Changing culture or making people better employees were considered secondary goals in relation to the primary goals of helping students to become wise and virtuous, and of passing on culture, and one culture in particular, the culture of the Christian West. How classical education works. In classical education, students study two things: the humanities and the liberal arts. They focus their attention first on what the Victorian scholar Matthew Arnold called, quote, the best which has been thought and said." End quote. In Western civilization, our focus should be on what I call the three cultures: Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, or the Greeks, the Romans, and the Hebrews. Why study these particular cultures? We should study the Greeks because they were the archetype of philosophical and literary man. They were the original philosophers and poets. Every great idea, and every bad one, came from some Greek somewhere. All you've got to do is trace it back. Why study the Romans? We study the Romans because they were the archetype of practical political man. They were the road builders and the republicans of ancient times. These are the people who ran the world for 1,000 years. They ran the most enduring government history has ever known. In fact, the founding fathers used the old Roman Republic as their model in constructing the American Republic. Why study the Hebrews? We study the Hebrews because they were the archetype of spiritual man. From them we learn how God deals with individuals and nations. In studying these three cultures, classical education does not ignore American history and culture. In fact, in order to fully understand American civilization, a knowledge of these three cultures is crucial since, as political philosopher Russell Kirk has pointed out, all three of them were essential in the forming of our thought, our political institutions, and our moral principles. We study these three cultures and the great works they produced because they constitute our heritage as Western people. A study of these cultures tells us where we have been in the past so that we will know better where to go in the future. Lynn Cheney, former head of the National Endowment of the Humanities under Ronald Reagan, once said that if you graduate from school not knowing what Western civilization is, then you are not truly an educated person. She was right. In addition to studying the great books and the stories of great men, classical education also studies the liberal arts. How many times have you heard someone talk about the importance of teaching students critical thinking skills? The problem with all of the rhetoric about critical thinking skills is that the people who talk about it most are the ones least able to define them. In fact, the chief reason modern educators talk so much about critical thinking skills is because they have abandoned the only system of critical thinking skills worthy of the name, the liberal arts. The liberal arts include grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. These are the generalizable intellectual skills that you use no matter what subject you are studying or what you do. The liberal arts teach the two kinds of mental skills: the linguistic skills, the first three liberal arts, or the trivium, and the mathematical skills, what we call the quadrivium. The trivium consists first of grammar, which is the study of the structure of language, and this was studied by learning a foreign language, preferably an inflected foreign language. In other words, one which, in addition to having an organized verb system, like most modern languages, has an organized noun, objective system. Latin was always the preferred language for this purpose because not only was it an inflected foreign language, but its grammar was the most organized, systemic, and regular of any language. It also is the basis for 60% of academic English vocabulary. Logic is the study of the structure and rules of rational thought, and this is taught by studying the Aristotelian system of traditional logic. Through logic, a student learns the proper use of words and statements in constructing an argument. He learns the rules of validity, the different kinds of arguments, and what each was for. He also learns how to identify bad reasoning called logical fallacies. Rhetoric is the study of the rules of persuasion. As it was organized and taught by writers such as Aristotle, the great rhetorician and theoretician of rhetoric, Quintilian, the great teacher of rhetoric, and Cicero, the great practitioner of rhetoric. It involves studying the three kinds of persuasive appeals: ethos, logos, and pathos, the different branches of oratory, deliberate, forensic, and ceremonial, and the 5 canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Students may also study St. Augustine, who used the skills he learned from these great thinkers to articulate Christian truths. The quadrivium, the last four of the seven liberal arts, consists of arithmetic, the study of discrete number, geometry, the study of continuous number, music, the application of discrete number, and astronomy, the application of continuous number. Today, we would also include modern branches of science and mathematics. The trivium consists of the arts of language, and the quadrivium the arts of mathematics. The first was qualitative, and the second quantitative. Together they equipped a student to approach any other subject. The modern or neoclassical education movement emphasizes the language skills of the trivium because many classical educators believe that math and the sciences have superseded language in the modern curriculum. Classical educators believe that this is a mistake, and that language is even more important than math and the sciences in the leading of a productive and happy life. The most important employment skills, and the skills that many employers say are the hardest to find today, are basic thinking skills. These are not just math and science skills, STEM skills as they are now called, but the even more practical language and communication skills. The liberal arts teaches both kinds of skills. Classical education, then, is the study of the classics and the liberal arts, the best that has been thought and said, and the intellectual skills that equip a student to think critically. It is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue through the study of the great books and the development of basic critical thinking skills in order to pass on and preserve Western civilization. Classical education is making a comeback. More and more, parents have realized that their children are being shortchanged in our schools, and more of them are realizing that it was not always this way, and that their children deserve something more. Well, that's the book.